Okay, this is the story of the Princess on the Glass Hill. We're going to go right on through it. Let's see how much I can go without tongue twisting myself. Once upon a time, there was a man who already. Once upon a time, there was a man who had a meadow which lay on the side of a mountain. In the meadow was a barn, in which he stored hay. But there had not been much hay in the barn these last 2 years, for every St. John's Eve, what am I, a crazy person? When the grass was in the height of its vigor, it was eaten clean up. But no one knew the beast that could devour a field in one night, and it seemed there was naught that could be done. That is still a hard phrase to say. Well, the first time was bad, and the second time was worse. The third time would be just a pure shame. So the man declared that he would end the mystery. He ordered the eldest of his 3 sons to sit and watch overnight, and forbid the creature its meal. But that one sat in the barn and kept watch, and when the earth quaked, the walls roared with the vibrations, he covered his eyes to stopped his ears. In the morning the field was barren as was before. Now the next St. John's Eve the man set his second son to watch. This one swore that the devil himself would not get past him, and mocked his brothers for his failure. That's about normal guy mentality, or at least it was. But that one too felt the earth quake at midnight, and the walls shiver, and coming step of the Let's try that again. But this one felt the earth quake at midnight, and the walls shiver, and coming step of the beast. He screwed his eyes shut and stuffed his stockings in his ears. In the morning, the field was barren as was before. The third year came round. Now the man said to his youngest son, known as Cinderlad, must take his turn at the watch. But the others laughed at him and mocked him. Well, you're just the right one to watch the hay, you who have never learnt anything but how to sit amongst the ashes and bake yourself, they said. Cinderlad, however, didn't trouble himself about what they had said, but when evening drew near, rambled away to the outlying fields. He concealed himself in the barn, and sure enough at midnight he felt the shaking and the quaking and a terrible thundering roar. The very ground reverberated with the pounding step of some beast. Cinderlad bade himself sit calmly and listen. Now the earth shook again, and he heard the sounds of trees splitting. He nodded to himself and paid extra close attention to the sounds. A third deafening roar came, and the walls of the barn rippled like water. Cinderlad thought surely they'd crush him beneath him, and sat serenely, waiting to see what would happen. He drew a deep breath in preparation for the blow he thought would follow, but none came. There was only silence, and for some moments Cinderlad remained still, and then he heard the sound of a horse, standing and chewing just outside the barn door. And when he stepped out of the barn, indeed there was a horse, the finest he had ever seen. Its saddle and bridle were of shining copper, and there was a suit of armor set upon it, as though waiting for a rider. So Cinderlad took out his flint, his steel for striking fire, then threw it over the horse, and it had no power to stir from that spot, and became so tame that the boy could do what he liked with it. So he put on the armor and rode the horse towards home, but before he got there, dismounted. He now hid the horse and the armor and walked home. When he got there, his brothers mocked him and abused him, berated him for the loss of the crop. But when he told them that it stood still, they ran to see, and sure enough, when they got there, the grass was all standing just as long and as thick as it had been the night before. that following next St. John's Eve, neither elder brother would confess to the other that they had fear in them for their time in the barn. Neither would go. So instead, jeered and cajoled at Cinderlad, for he had volunteered to go once more. Now the noise and the roaring and the shivering and shaking were twice as bad as this time as it was before, and Cinderlad was sore to put. That's a really weird wording. Sore put to remain calm. Really old way of saying things, I guess. Yet he did so, and when the creaking and crashing had ceased at last, he could hear once more the sound of a horse eating just outside the door, and this time he found a beast twice as fine as the last, with a saddle and bridle of silver, and a suit of armor that was silver besides. Another weird phrasing, but okay. So once again he threw out his steel for striking steel over the steed's head, and charmed it into stillness. Then he put on the suit of silver and mounted the horse, and rode to the place where the other horse, I'm getting tongue-tied, and suit of copper were stored, and he left them there. Then walked home, and his brothers mocked him again, yet he let the words roll off his back like water from a duck. The years rolled past, and it was St. John's Eve again. Once more it seemed that Cinderlad would go alone to face the fearsome creature. The events would pass, being now familiar to him. Cinderlad ate a good supper, then went out to the outlying fields to keep watch. Sure enough, as midnight came, so came the roaring, the earthquaking, the air shaking, a cacophony of sounds only 3 times louder than ever before. Once again, when the air was stilled, all Cinderlad could hear was the sound of a horse chewing. He looked out the door, and wouldn't you know it, the finest horse yet, with a saddle and bridle of gold, and a golden suit of armor in the saddle, just waiting for a rider. And Cinderlad donned the armor, rode his horse to his hiding place, and hid both armors and horse as well. Then went home, and was abused as usual. Though he had saved the crop 3 years in a row, it didn't make his brothers any kinder to Cinderlad. Now the king of the country in which Cinderlad's father dwelt had a daughter whom he would give to no one who could not ride up to the top of the glass hill. For there was a high hill of glass, slippery as ice, and it was close to the king's palace. His daughter lived in a little house at the top of it. She sat in the garden every day, with 3 golden apples in her lap. The one who could ride up and take them would have her for his bride. The king let this be proclaimed. So princes, nobles, countries, and gallants come thither from the very ends of the world. Of course, Cinderlad's brother went to the contest, taking their best horses from the stables. When their youngest brother begged to go, they simply laughed at him and left him alone. Well then, said the lad quietly, I will go alone, by myself. And he went to the place where he kept his horses, that was saddled with a copper, and put on the copper armor, and went before the king. Okay, I just lost my place. There we go. And all the other knights who had worn themselves raw and slipping and sliding and staggering and attempted to climb the glass hill told him that he might as just well spare himself the trouble for trying to ride up it. But he paid them no heed, and rode forward. He rode straight up that glass hill, and when he got 1/3 of the way, the princess looked down and saw him, Then she threw one of the golden apples down after him, and it rolled into his shoe. Then Cinderlad rode down again and away before anyone could stop him. That evening the king called council. Let all contenders come together, and he who had the golden apple should show it. But no man came forward, though all had seen the apple roll into the man's shoe. The next day the contest continued. All the young men strained and clutched and used their most cunning moves to try to gain a toehold on the glass mountain, but they could not do it. Just as the sun was about to set, along came a knight in silver armor, riding a finer horse than any had seen. This man rode straight past the crowds of cheering youth, and without a pause rode straight up the glass hill. When he was 2/3 the way up, the princess saw him, and thought to herself, she liked this knight still better than the last. She threw down him an apple, and it rolled into his shoe, and as soon as he got down the glass hill, he rode away so fast that no one could see what had become of him. That night the brothers came home and found Cinderlad sitting among the ashes in the kitchen. They chided him for his dirty ways, and told him of the bright knight in silver who had come that night. When Cinderlad longed to be allowed to go the following day, which he knew would be the last day of the contest, they laughed at him and said, "Oh, indeed, he was brighter than the ashes you sit grubbing among." And when they had left him alone the next day, he went to the place where he had his horses, and now fastened on the golden armor, and rode the steed with the saddle and bridle of gold. And when he had ridden past all the other competitors, he rode straight for the glass hill. It glinted in the sunlight when the beam still shone upon it, seemingly to be made rather of brilliant cut diamonds than mere glass. At the bottom, where the shadows of night were falling, the cold, smooth hill was as black as the bottom of the sea. Cinderlad rode straight to the top of the hill. There sat the princess, with a single golden apple in her lap. He snatched this from her, doffed his cap, and turned and rode down the hill. When he got to the bottom, he galloped away and was gone before anyone knew which way to look. The next day the king commanded that all the men in the kingdom appear before him, that he who had the 3 golden apples would show himself. So they all went in turn, first princes, then knights, and none of them had the golden apple. The king and merry men had seen the princess toss the apple, and had seen with their own eyes the fruit roll into the knight's shoe, yet no one showed the apple. One after the other, young men lined up. Cinderlad's brothers were last in line. When they had turned out their pockets and sworn they had not the golden apple, the king asked them if they had no more brothers at home. They did have a brother, they said, but he never left the cinder heap on any of those days. "Never mind that," said the king. "Everyone else has come to the palace. Let him come too." And Cinderlad came before the king. And the king asked, "Hast thou the golden apple?" And Cinderlad replied, "Yes, here's the first one, and here's the second one. Oh, and here's the third one too." He cried out, and threw off his sooty rags and appeared before them in the bright golden armor. So the king gave him half the kingdom, and the princess came down from the glass hill, and there was a wedding. And if they are not left off of their merrymaking, they must still be there. And that is The Princess on the Glass Hill. Shorter a story than I thought it was, because it's only 14 minutes. But anyway, ta-ta.